Story 1. My dad had a younger brother who died as a teenager. No one in the family spoke about him except once. My dad suddenly said, "I remember one time my brother and I were fighting in the kitchen. I got so mad at him that I peed on him." That is the only story I know about my uncle, the one time my dad peed on him. Story 2. Dad was in the Marines. He was part of a weapons demonstration, just one of the guys firing a weapon for a group of officers. It was some kind of explosive projectile, but I don't remember the model. It was a dud and didn't launch, then just fell on the ground, causing Dad to back away immediately because no one knew when it might explode. Of course, it rolled toward the officers. Not quickly, but they all scattered. Nobody wanted to touch it, so it rolled down a slope and then politely right under a tank, where it exploded without seriously damaging anything or anyone due to the large piece of metal on top of the tank. Story 3. My dad stopped practicing criminal law when a client he was really invested in was executed. He casually mentioned that during a road trip when we happened to be near where the victim was found. Story 4. One day, he randomly pulled out an old newspaper article about him free climbing a giant tree in California to help a parachutist who got caught at the top. My dad cut him loose so he did not lose blood flow, while my uncle went to find a phone to call emergency services since this was in the 1970s. The parachutist survived with minor injuries. Story 5. One time when I was 5 years old, my siblings and I were taken to visit my dad's office. I had a fun time running around, exploring all the cubicles and boardrooms, and making a lot of noise as toddlers and young kids tend to do. It turned out my dad had left that job months earlier, and the boss had been very late with the final paycheck and severance payment. Dad knew that a potential major investor was meeting his boss that day, so he brought us in to deliberately cause chaos during the meeting. Eventually, his boss came out and said to him, "You know, it's really unprofessional to bring children into an office like this." To which Dad retorted, in front of the investor, "You know, it's really unprofessional to not pay your workers." Dad got the money he was owed by the end of that week. Story 6. When the Premier of Ontario was elected several years ago, my dad had the news on and said, "Oh no, that's Doug. I used to buy hash from that guy when we were in high school." Story 7. Ex-fiancé's dad was an interesting man. I really liked him. He mentioned he had been drafted to serve in the Vietnam War and I asked him about it. He said he had a much better experience than most people, and that was why he did not talk about it. He understood many people were far more traumatized by it and did not want to diminish their experience by discussing his own. The most traumatic thing that happened to me was that we were extremely bored keeping watch at a base surrounded by minefields. I was high on acid because there was nothing else to do when a cow walked past the woods and into the minefield. I was tripping and hoping it was not real, but eventually the cow stepped on a mine and exploded. Imagine being bored in a watchtower in another country, fighting a war no one wants, high on acid, and watching a cow wander into a minefield. It felt like an eternity hoping it did not step on a mine, but then it did, and you could not be sure it even happened until the next day when you saw the remains next to a scorched spot in the earth. What a senseless war. I always liked her dad. What a fascinating man. Story 8. I was 4 or 5 when my dad told me a local steam power plant was a cloud factory. They got the old cloud factory fired up, he said. He had a whole spiel about how farmers paid for the clouds and the rain would come out. Took me until I was maybe 8 to figure it out. Marge Taylor Greene's dad must have told her. The same thing. My dad also made us watch for the leaving county and state signs. We had to lift our feet and clack our heels so we didn't drag dirt from the first county, town, or state into the other. He told us it was a law to keep bugs from spreading. We spent car trips looking out the window so we wouldn't get a ticket. Story 9. My dad was in the Air Force for 23 years. When he was stationed in Panama in the early 1980s, one of my sisters was born, and my mom flew back to the United States to have the baby. About a year ago, my dad and I were on the phone, and he shared this story with me. He knew that a direct flight on a military plane would be easier and cheaper. So he had a pilot friend who was flying from the base in the United States closest to us list my mom, myself, and my baby sister as miscellaneous cargo on the flight manifest so we could get back to Panama without trouble. Story 10. mentioned in casual conversation when I was a tween that he had been married once before he married my mother. Then acted shocked that I did not remember him casually mentioning it once when I was around 3 or 4. Story 11. When my father was a teenager, he and his friends rolled a bowling ball down a large hill, aiming directly at the open door of a bar. They made the shot perfectly. The bowling ball zoomed right into the bar at maximum speed, and moments later a few angry drunks stormed outside in confusion. My father ran off giggling with his friends. Life was simpler before mobile phones. Story 12. My dad is an accountant. He claimed that 4 local farms would have gone under repeatedly if he had not manipulated the financial records. It may be true, actually. Many small farms exist because a clever accountant made them appear very poor to obtain grants, subsidies, and loan forgiveness. However, it upset my mom. She was trying to make a point about honesty, and Dad bragged about this instead. Story 13. My dad was involved in a federal murder case that occurred in Arizona. I remember him going to court as a kid because he would buy candy for the other jurors, and it made me jealous. A few years ago, he told me that in the town where the suspect was arrested, everyone was either an agent or an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The gas station clerk, the grocery store employees, the post office, everyone was working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to catch the specific person. The way he described it, the entire town was enlisted or hired to catch this individual. Story 14. Mom, Dad, and us 6 kids hit the road for a family trip in a Ford LTD station wagon with wood grain panels. Yes, like the family truckster. We were pulling a homemade trailer with a full-size Buick axle, wheels, and hubcaps. Picture that. Then hear this from inside the car. Driving past a water treatment plant, my dad turned down the radio to share some fatherly wisdom. Kids, he pointed to the treatment plant, that there is proof that the water you use, you drink the next day. Then he turned the radio back up and we drove on. Story 15. My dad once told me he stole and used the identity of a deceased infant for several years. He destroyed the identification and resumed using his real identity a month before the Federal Bureau of Investigation came looking for him. He was never charged, and he is clean from that now. He also told me he used to drive trucks up the East Coast, selling coral and drugs. I am pretty sure the coral was illegal too. He lived in that truck for about 5 years. Before giving up the false identification, he narrowly escaped arrest during a drug bust. His friend was arrested, but he was not. The police saw his fake identification and let him walk away. He said he used to be a heavy cocaine user until a few months before I was born in 1999. He snorted cocaine and gambled away a mechanic business and a tow truck within 3 years, in his early to mid-20s. The tow truck once went vertical while towing a semi-truck out of an icy ditch. He successfully freed the semi-truck when several other tow operators could not. He said he worked security for sex workers. He was friends with a pimp and provided security. His pimp friend was shot dead in the parking lot of his strip club some years ago. He owned a 1960s Dodge Charger, a Dodge Challenger, and a 1977 Pontiac Trans Am, all with extensively upgraded engines. He is a very skilled mechanic. The Charger and Challenger were both wrecked by crashing into telephone poles. The Trans Am was sold to pay off debt. All of these vehicles would be very valuable now. He still has the license plate from the Challenger hanging in his garage. A friend of his was killed in a motorcycle accident in front of our house while he was working in the yard. He recorded the aftermath of the accident on tape. I was about 2 years old. He has shared many stories with me. Fortunately, he is now clean and far from his past. He pays his taxes under his real name, has cleared his debt, and is now in debt again. Story 16. Dad was in the Navy during the Vietnam War. He was discharged because he kept buying venomous creatures at Asian ports. First, it was some type of snake. It was found during an inspection and thrown into the sea. The one that got him discharged was a large tropical spider. It got loose, so he would poke around in his locker with a stick to make sure it was not hiding in a uniform. It eventually made its way into a bridge officer's wardrobe, and that ended his time in the Navy. Story 17. My dad told me when I was 15, it is easy to get laid, but it is much harder to have a healthy relationship. He looks like James Dean. I do not. Story 18. I'll offer my granddad's lore. Trickled out from my mom. He was a high school dropout who worked as a customs officer when my mom was born. He took bribes, and to make sure he didn't have cash on him when inspected, he once bought a piano. That was the piano I grew up learning to play on. Mom brought it to Canada from Hong Kong. The humidity difference meant it didn't keep tune well at the extremities. After being forced out on suspicion of being crooked, he managed to return to his education and eventually became a criminal defense lawyer. Story 19. One day, when I was probably 11 or 12, my dad decided to sit me down for the drug talk. He told me that the reason I shouldn't do drugs is because he and my Uncle Kevin used to pick magic mushrooms in the fields behind the high school in the Pacific Northwest, where they grow in grass and some with chips, not cow manure. They would eat them before class, then trip and laugh about nothing all day. They had a lot of fun but didn't really learn anything. Many of my late Septembers and Octobers were spent in the parks and fields near that high school, where friends and I found large growths of psilocybe biacistus and psilocybe cyanescens, and began a lifelong love of mushrooms and cactus. Even now, very successful and in my 30s. Thanks, Dad. Changed my whole life. Story 20. This story is from my mother because my father understandably does not like it. He was a civil engineer in our town before he retired, and one of his major projects was a bridge spanning a sizable river valley that connected two parts of town. The bridge sank. Story 21. Not my dad personally. However, my half-brother's dad mentioned that his and my mom's first apartment was destroyed by Danny Green during the Cleveland car bombings. I told him this past year, 7 years after she passed away. Story 22. I knew my father had done a contracting job in Greenland in the 1970s, but I did not know all of his co-workers were members of the Church of Scientology until he mentioned it to me one day with minimal further explanation. Story 23. My dad and a few of his friends joined the military on what was probably a drunken dare. At the last minute, most of them backed out, but he was too far into the process, so he was stuck there. That was commonly known, but the surprising part came when he shared this story. One time, while he was deployed in South Korea, he and a friend had some leave and were taking a ferry to a town. After a while, they noticed that all the locals were staring at them with total disdain. An old man approached, grabbed the sandwich out of his friend's hand, took a bite, and shoved it into his uniform pocket. A Korean military police officer appeared suddenly, said something that made the crowd back off, and then told my dad and his friend to stay close until they reached the port. Until the officer arrived, my dad said he was planning how to jump ship if the crowd became more hostile. Story 24. My parents met because my dad went to a high school party in the 1990s to sell marijuana. He sold everything he brought, had a large amount of cash in his pocket, and wanted to leave. His friends said no, so he put the money in his back pocket and sat on a couch. He happened to sit next to my mom. He told me this as we shared a bowl over a campfire. It was a fun little story from my dad. Story 25. Dad asked, "How many fingers and toes do I have?" I replied, 20. Dad said, "That's the number of days I haven't smoked marijuana since you were born." I was 15. Story 26. When my father was in his early 20s in the 1970s, he worked in a national park. While hiking in the bush, he came across a group of scouts who were in shock. Half the scouts were hiking along the top of a ridgeline, throwing rocks down the bank, while the other half were walking below the ridge. One child was hit in the head and killed. My father had to calm the rest of the scouts and stayed with the body until more rangers and the police arrived with a stretcher to carry the child out. Story 27. My dad told me the story of how Charlton Heston gave my grandma a phone call. During the Vietnam War era, Heston was one of the biggest movie stars. He came to Vietnam on a United Service Organizations tour and ended up sitting on my dad's tank. After talking to the press, he asked the soldiers in my dad's tank if there was anything he could do for them. My dad, thinking he was just there for the photo opportunity, said, "Yeah, give my mom a call and tell her I'm okay," never thinking he would actually do it. It took Heston a couple of minutes to convince my grandma it was not a prank that one of my uncles was playing on her when he actually followed through with calling her for my dad. The local paper ran a story on it, and my mom still has it in a scrapbook somewhere. Story 28. He was pranking the band kids by rubbing a hot pepper on the mouthpieces. He forgot to wash his hands, so when he went to urinate, karma got him back. Story 29. Before I was born, my dad was in a Christian rock band but quit because he found out one of his bandmates was a rapist. The band fell apart because he owned all their sound equipment and took it with him. He became really skilled at running sound, and one of his friends said, "Hey, I was going to tour with this band running sound for them, but I can't. Are you interested?" My dad had to turn it down because he had just married my mom, and she didn't want him to go. The band he would have toured with was Styx. Yes, Styx. Before anyone asks, I don't know the name of my dad's former band, and I wouldn't say it even if I did, since I don't want to dox him or myself. I don't think any good recordings of their music exist except for one VHS tape that one of my dad's former friends still has. That friend played it for me at a Christmas party, and my dad was very uncomfortable seeing it again, so I don't press him about it. Story 30. My dad told me his father, who was in the Navy most of his life, had fought with the military in Korea. Nobody knew until he was on his deathbed and they finally reviewed his medical records. He and his brother enlisted to fight in Korea, but my grandfather lied and said he was 18 when he was only 17. They got separated in Vancouver before heading overseas. My grandfather was wounded and sent home to the east coast of Canada, while his brother settled just outside Vancouver when he returned. My grandfather never spoke about his time in Korea, and if you know anything about that conflict, you will understand why. My dad never met his uncle until after his own father died, and he only met him once before he died about 8 years ago. His uncle filled in some of the gaps, but they never saw each other again, although they did keep in touch on and off over the years. Story 31. Not far into his career practicing medicine in Central Florida in the 1980s, my dad once had a shifty-looking patient in the waiting room who refused to respond to his name when called, instead demanding the front desk use a pseudonym. After a quick exam, my dad made a tentative diagnosis of gonorrhea. Instead of asking about the disease, prognosis, or treatment, the patient began to threaten my dad, promising consequences if anybody else found out. Not expecting the confusion on my dad's face, he followed up with, "Don't you know who I am? My dad, a transplant from Long Island," just shook his head, and the patient left briskly. Once the door closed, Dad's staff let him know it was a television megachurch pastor. Story 32. My dad told me about his ex-girlfriend before my mom and how he felt she was the love of his life. The only reason they broke up was because he did not want to move miles away from his hometown and family to live with her. He met my mom a few months later and married her after 6 months of dating. Story 33. I was in the car with my father when he told me that when he was a preteen, his friends, who were also preteens aged around 12 to 14, decided to take a bulldozer and drive it. There was construction nearby. They crashed into a house, killing a dog and injuring multiple people. They were all jailed. My father declined to hang out with them that day. Story 34. My dad used to tell me he would kill me if I did half the things he did. Years later, I found out he got caught by the Federal Bureau of Investigation when he was young for breaking into train cars. Story 35. I recently visited my homeland with my dad. The people we spent most of our time with, his friends from high school, are all involved in local politics or have significant influence. We stayed in some very nice places for free and were VIP guests at a few local political events. I joked with him, saying if he had his life together, I could be living an elite lifestyle here instead of working hourly in the United States. Story 36. My dad one day randomly mentioned in a conversation about my depression that he had to drive his mother to the hospital 3 separate times because she accidentally took too much medication. He casually told me that the youngest time was when he was about 12 years old and could not understand why I was so surprised, upset, or inquisitive. Story 37. As a child and teenager, he hot-wired a bulldozer to knock a tree that his brothers had set on fire into a river. Story 38. My dad had an electrical engineering degree from Villanova and designed magnetic core memory for computers in the 1960s. He told me I did not have the math skills to work in computers. I make more than he ever did working with computers now. Story 39. When he was a child, He used to go for ice cream with the only black man on his father's softball team, while the rest of the team went to the tavern. Black people were not allowed there. They are white. They live in Canada. Story 40. None positive. Sadly, my father was unpleasant for most of his life. His stories about his father made me more disappointed in him the more I heard. Story 41. There was this one time when he suddenly blurted out how he and his grandfather almost died because they were caught in a storm while fishing in a small boat. He also experienced a storm in the same waters in a much larger boat, and it was very intense. Another time, he was part of an emergency medical response team after a natural disaster. He had to go to a smaller island to assess the situation and provide help. As they approached the island, he and his crew saw many bodies floating in the water. Keep in mind, he shared both of these stories while we were eating. Bonus family story involving me. Apparently, there was a lone gunman waving a gun at the hospital while my mother was pregnant with me. She said she dove down to avoid gunfire. It has been a running joke between us for years that I might have hit my head in the womb during the chaos, and that is why I am so unusual. Story 42. God. I could probably fill a book with them. It always happens when we are on a road trip too. To name but a few, he used to be muscle for the mob, he was in the Hells Angels and still has friends he could call if he ever needed an alibi. He went skydiving while I was in school without telling me or my stepmom. His friends used to get him drunk so they could bet on him in bar fights. He raised and trained horses for show. One kicked him so badly he finished the show with a broken leg and wouldn't let the paramedics cut off his brand new custom red leather boots. He won that competition. He has a friend that rehabs and raises panthers. This is on top of the crazy stuff I already knew. Story 43. My parents divorced when I was a young child. My mother was his second wife and she got full custody. I spent time with him semi-regularly. When I was 14, my father gave me a ride to my friend's birthday dinner at TGI Fridays. While waiting in the parking lot, he pointed out the motel across the street and told me that's where he caught his ex-wife cheating on him with a paying man. That's how I found out my father remarried after my mother, to my former babysitter. Story 44. For context, my dad is a very likable person without even trying to be. He talks to all sorts of people without being intrusive. One day, he was talking to a neighbor on the block. They casually mentioned wanting to sell a cabin but didn't know where to start. One thing led to another, and my dad was offered $10,000 if he found a serious buyer. A week and some calls later, he connected them with somebody and received $10,000. Story 45. My dad was a teenager in Detroit in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He had a friend whose older brother sold marijuana while delivering pizzas. He would put it in a pizza box and walk it right to the front door. The guy would get what my dad described as a 40-gallon trash bag of marijuana weekly. He used to let my dad and his friends smoke whatever they wanted in exchange for helping to divide it into small bags, play basketball in the driveway, and keep watch. My dad was all about it until his friend's brother decided to move on to selling heroin. Story 46. My dad was a clown and has a few stories. He was doing a show at a party, and just as he was about to leave, a kid asked him why he had a sports car. My dad told the kid it was because he was the world's fastest clown. He backed out of the driveway and zoomed down the road. Story 47. He said he saw Alice in Chains and Nirvana in 1989. He lived in Seattle during that time. He remembered the venue for Alice in Chains, and looking at concert history, it was their third or fourth documented show. Story 48. My father told me that when he was a teenager, he ran apple brandy from his country home to the big cities of Albany and Schenectady, New York. We did not really believe him until I was 18, taking him to lunch with leftover indigenous grant money. A retired police officer sat next to us and asked him if his cousins still made hard cider and brandy. Story 49. My dad is a Vietnam veteran, and after he came home, he followed his true passion, playing the drums. This all happened before he met my mom, settled down, had children, and traded drumsticks for a school principal job. He toured with numerous bands of different genres, but he loved rock, blues, and funk the best. He lived in Houston, Texas, during his heyday and would tour all over the United States opening for various bands. He would tell us countless stories. Playing with Christopher Cross and being there when he got his first record deal to release his self-titled album, the one with Sailing. Being friends with Billy Gibbons and playing with him. Getting invited to a party where members of Led Zeppelin were in attendance. And my dad, being an Oklahoma reservation boy, couldn't get over all the different cheeses they had. Every now and then, he tells us something new, or we ask him about something he has told us before. He is a man full of stories. Story 50. I was at my friend's house and her dad went to use ketchup. The watery stuff came out first because it was a new bottle. He said, "Now girls, just know this could get you pregnant too." 5 or so years later, he was my college history professor. We were taking a test, so it was quiet. He called my name and said, "Remember the ketchup?" I nodded and he said, "I meant pre-ejaculate. Tell your boyfriend to wear a condom." Story 51. My father did not want me to know anything about his life, and whenever something slipped, he would immediately become evasive and then shut down. I do not have any good stories from him or about him. I am a father now too, and many of my best stories involve foolish things I saw my father do while he was blind with rage. One time we went fishing in a thunderstorm because he had purchased some new rain gear. The rain gear was worthless and unpleasant, the fish were not biting, and because of the rain, the water level in the river started rising. We persevered through this situation for about 6 hours in tense silence as he stewed in his squeaky little yellow coat and pants. Eventually, he got a bite but lost the fish. This was when things fell apart. My father stood up, ripped his coat off, and then tossed the rod and reel about 50 feet into the river channel. Only as it splashed down did he hear my uncle scream, "Oh no, that is mine." So then we spent the next 6 hours in tense silence as we fished for the rod and reel. Eventually, we managed to hook it and reel it in from the bottom of the river, which was perhaps the most relieved I have ever felt in my entire life. During college, I worked as a laborer for my father in several different settings, such as building concrete forms in an aluminum foundry or running a jackhammer with a 15-foot drill bit in a chemical plant. I saw many foolish things during that time, only some of which are funny. One time I was helping my father lay out the dimensions of a new structure. We were walking along a catwalk about 12 feet above a massive container of sulfuric acid. I do not remember exactly how we ended up standing directly over the tank, and I do not recall why the tank was open, presumably because that particular unit was already shut down ahead of the work he was about to start. What I recall vividly is the noise he made as he fumbled his calculator and dropped it over the side of the catwalk, directly into the vessel. It was in his hands 1 second and then gone the next. I do not remember hearing it hit bottom, so I have always assumed some residual amount of weak acid was down there ready to eat it up. My father's reaction was somewhat muted. He simply yelled, "God damn it, boy," before he stormed off. Something about that impotent rage checks all the comedic boxes for me. I typed all this out with the goofiest smile on my face. Story 52. My great-grandfather was the youngest of 13 siblings, only 7 of whom survived. He fought in the Navy during World War I. He wanted to fight but was underage, so he lied on his recruitment paperwork at age 16 and was sent to war. His ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic Ocean on the way, and he was pronounced missing in action, presumed dead. He not only made it to shore but also fought in the war and obviously made it home. He later served as a mounted police officer and then as a train engineer. He had a fistfight with his son, my grandfather, in his 50s and smoked cigars before dying in his early 70s. He left us some property in the mountains of New England that he bought for very little. We rebuilt it together as his descendants into a family lodge. 45 of his descendants get together once or twice a year there now to talk about him and others who never met him. A red-blooded American legacy if I have ever seen one. One quote he always had that outlived him was, "For the extra couple of bucks, always fly first class." Not always realistic, but the carpe diem spirit is there. Story 53. When he was 18, he moved to England and recorded an album with his band. It actually sounded great. They were very much trying to be AC/DC as it was the 1980s, but I really liked it. They were called Electric Blue, and all dyed their hair blue. Story 54. Driving through the countryside one day, He told me that he used to go hunting in the area. He was in the paramilitary in my country, and a year before he joined, the government created the Dangerous Drugs Act to prosecute Rastafarians. Also, while having breakfast one day, he told me he was shot and then thrown through a window during the invasion of Grenada. Story 55. My father was a white minister living in Harlem and opposed the drug dealers. They became so angry that they shot a bullet into our home. Story 56. He has a secret half-sibling that his parents and other siblings never talk about. However, my father said he tracked down this half-sibling and connected with him on social media, and they have been talking for years now. Story 57. Apparently, at some point in my dad's experience of being a teenager in 1970s Britain, it was very stylish to wear cat's eyes, the reflectors, not the animal's eyeball, as an accessory on your jacket. I cannot confirm whether this was ever actually in style. I can confirm, however, that my dad and his two younger brothers had a small setup to get hold of these stylish cat's eyes. My dad had both younger brothers do the hard work of removing the cat's eye from the middle of the road, while he served as the lookout. My dad has a degenerative eye disease, and his vision loss was so severe that he had been declared legally blind by this point. There is some familial debate about whether my uncles were made aware of this before they were roped into his criminal escapade. His preferred descriptor for his 99.9% vision loss is a slight eyesight problem, which also tells you a lot about him. Story 58. My parents are from a country with a dictatorship. My father was very active in violent protests against the government. The dictator was scheduled to give a speech at a bus station. The night before the speech, my father and a few others bombed it. One of the men was caught and gave up the names of the others, including my father. My father spent the next 3 weeks being tortured in prison. They beat him in the head until he passed out. He would wake up, then the torture would continue. Fortunately, the man who gave the orders to torture him left town. My grandmother used this opportunity to bribe a guard. He accepted the bribe on one condition. He had to go straight to the airport and leave the country. The reasoning was that if he was caught, he would be tortured until he revealed who freed him. This story, along with some other details, was something I had always heard growing up. Then one day, when I was about 12 years old, he told me about one of the tortures that got the other man to confess. They took a wire, wrapped it around his penis, and slowly twisted it tighter and tighter. From his tone of voice and the way he described it, I wondered if the same had happened to him. I remember thinking, why are you telling me this? I'm just a kid. Story 59. Many years after retirement and after 2 glasses of wine, my dad suddenly opened up about briefing Central Intelligence Agency operatives with equipment his team developed for the field. His stories included very specific embassies and world events in the 1980s. I have lived my whole life knowing that my dad was a radio engineer with high military clearance, but until that night, I had not connected how he was clearly working within the world of espionage. After listening to his reminiscing, I asked a question or two, and he clammed up and would not provide any more specifics. Story 60. I was showing my uncle a car I really wanted to buy, and we ended up talking about our favorite cars. My uncle mentioned that his favorite car used to be a menace to both himself and my dad, and they had to get crafty on the turns to beat each other. I asked, "What do you mean you and Dad?" Turns out my uncle and my dad used to street race Fast and the Furious style. They would call their college friends and rivals the night before, make bets, and plan their routes. They would meet up, race, and use their walkie-talkies to notify if police were showing up. My dad didn't race as much as my uncle, but he was the mechanic and would spend hours doing repairs, upgrades, and finding ways to make their family car faster. He used to sneak into the local mechanic shop to watch how they repaired things so he could do it himself. It all made sense afterward why my dad never needed online videos to fix any car part on our family cars. Story 61. When my stepdad was working for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, he was asked to help with something on Jacques Cousteau's boat, the Calypso. He was a mechanical engineer. I can't remember exactly what it was. Jacques' wife made them a large container of punch, but it was basically just straight rum. My stepdad ended up getting so drunk that he slept on the top deck of the ship overnight. He tells this story completely nonchalantly. Story 62. He didn't spontaneously tell me, the man never tells me anything. I have to pry it out of him, but I didn't realize how many concerts he did security for while in the United States Air Force. He angered Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. He ended up holding onto the jacket for one of the members of AC/DC, can't remember which one, during their show at Dunnington Castle in 1991. Yes, I've tried to find him in the footage, but he was mostly underneath the stage. Women rushed the stage at a Randy Travis concert, and he didn't have time to move his hands. The one thing he did tell me was when I asked if he had been in California during the Golden State Killer case. His response: "No, but I did guard the house where the suspected accomplice to the son of Sam killed himself. Also, your mom's scan came back good." They didn't tell him anything and had to watch overnight until the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived. He found out a few days later. He also got to go on Air Force One, or whatever it's called when the president is not on board, when they were guarding it and giving the Secret Service agents a break. He had to sign a guest book of sorts and was told if he stole anything, it would be a felony. He also guarded a Chinese defector and had to guard a few Italian generals. So that's my dad lore. He's now almost 70, retired, and just enjoys being a cat dad. Story 63. When I was 4, there were many police officers on our street, and a policewoman let me sit in the front seat and ring the siren. I told that story when I was 25, and my dad said, "That was the day the neighbors got arrested for making phencyclidine." Thanks, Dad. A cherished childhood memory is now phencyclidine. Story 64. My grandfather was a drunk and abusive. He witnessed his mother stab his father before she left. It was not a good situation, so he ran away and hitchhiked from California to Iowa to live with his older brother when he was 14. He met my mother, and the rest is history. Story 65. My dad was a drill sergeant in the Army. He has the exact opposite disposition of a drill sergeant or drill instructor. I cannot fathom him doing it. Story 66. I was a kid, so I don't remember a lot of things back then. My dad told me about this a year ago. We were trying to find a new home in a small town. My dad ended up exposing an entire development of duplex homes to expand the town. It turned out the construction company didn't lay down the cement foundation properly. He found deep cracks behind some shelves in the basement cement walls of the sample house that was finished. He said he could fit his car key into the cracks. He involved the mayor and the provincial engineering authority. They had to tear down and redo all the new homes or cancel the project altogether. Luckily, no one was living in them yet. This was in the northern area where snow starts in October. Water would freeze and expand in the cracks of the cement, possibly causing mold problems in the summer. Eventually, this would destroy the houses. The construction company initially tried to avoid responsibility. Story 67. I told my dad I was visiting a friend who lives in Tucson many years ago, and the first thing he said was, "Don't go out to Tucson bars. That place is incredibly dangerous." It turns out that back in the 1980s, my dad and his team were roofing a large project in Tucson. They are from West Texas. After the first week, they went to a hole-in-the-wall bar where they were almost immediately harassed by some white patrons. My dad and his employees were either Mexican-American or Mexicans working with visas. The situation escalated to the point where they were face-to-face and ready to fight when one of the harassers pulled out a knife and started slashing the air at them. What the harassers did not realize is that roofers always carry roofing blades. One of my dad's employees pulled out his blade and slashed the arm of the man holding the knife. While the others were in shock that someone called the bluff, the attackers threw their stools down and ran out. My dad and his crew jumped into their truck and sped away while being chased. To my dad's knowledge, that man passed away several years ago, but he credits him with buying enough time for them to escape and potentially saving their lives. Anyway, I had a good time in Tucson. It was sketchy though. Story 68. He and a friend scared his cousin one night while she and her friends were driving down a rural road. A mutual friend was driving. Dad and his friend hid behind a low-hanging tree, leapt out, and said they would drag the two girls to Kazim, an old man half the town feared. It was a dumb prank that she still teases him about nearly 50 years later. Story 69. Dad, want to hear a story? You can't ever tell your sister, though. Me? Yeah, sure. Dad, One time I was at a friend's house to buy cocaine. Me, oh, it's one of those stories. Proceed. Dad. Anyway, I had ridden my motorcycle to get some party favors for the weekend. It was the 80s after all. The guy's phone rings, and it's someone at the station giving him a heads up that the police are on the way. The guy freaks out, throws a duffel bag on the coffee table and screams, "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" Pointing at a large amount of cocaine. So I pulled out my keys and said, "Trade it for my bike?" And he did. So here I am walking down the highway with 3 kilos of cocaine over my shoulder, smiling and waving at 6 squad cars speeding to my friend's house for no good reason. I threw a massive party, filled a large fishbowl with cocaine, and it took us a week to use it all. And we had a great time. The best part? Nobody in 5 counties could find any. So at the end of the week, I sold what was left for double and bought my motorcycle back and a Camaro. Story 70. This weekend, while walking around Whole Foods with my dad, I stopped by the frozen foods aisle to look for mozzarella sticks when he started telling me about how the best mozzarella sticks ever were the ones they served during midnight rations while deployed to Iraq. This was after a night of having to drive with night vision goggles, avoiding 3 improvised explosive devices on the way back to base, and not being able to get to sleep. He also casually told our family on the way to his retirement ceremony 16 years ago that he needed to pick up a combat action ribbon for his uniform. When we asked why, he responded, "Someone in a crowd threw a grenade in our Humvee and we got blown up." Funny guy. Story 71. My dad was German. He spoke in monotone with a thick, slurry accent. When I was about 8, the whole family went back home to visit our German relatives. While we were there, we took the ferry to Switzerland to go up into the Alps. This was around 1993, so the only entertainment was looking out the window. Thank God, because it was unlike anything I had ever seen. Switchbacks all the way up. Fantastic views. At one point, he pointed out the window and said, "See the goats? How do you think they climb all the way up here?" I said I didn't know, and he said, "You see, they have short left legs and long right legs. This way, they can walk around the mountain and go all the way to the top." I visited again around 2015 and brought my girlfriend, now my wife, to meet the German family. While there, I also took her to the Alps to see how beautiful the land was. We stopped at a restaurant on the way up. Of course, I saw the goats and the memory came flooding back. It was at the exact moment I opened my mouth to begin telling her about the goats with short left legs that I realized I had fallen hook, line, and sinker. I can't wait to bring my kids to see the short-legged goats. Story 72. When I got married, my wife became really interested in family genealogy. She just finds it fascinating. One day, she called me over and asked, "Who is Emily?" I replied, "I don't know, you tell me." She said, "Well, I found some documents referring to her in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I said, "Honey, there are 11 people with our last name, and I know them all. There is no Emily." My wife said, "Call your dad, see if he knows." I called my father, and he said, "There is no Emily, last name." My wife said, "Are you sure? Because I found some documents." He replied again, "There is no Emily, last name. However, if you mean Emma, then that would be my first wife." I said, "Dad, I'm 25, and this is the first I'm hearing of a first wife." He said, "Yes, we were married in college. As soon as we got married, she became an alcoholic, and every weekend was her with her head in a public trash can, puking from all she was drinking." I asked, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Dad, my main question is, with all the time you spent with your parents and siblings, I'm very surprised no one ever mentioned her. I lived with you for 18 years, and I understand how that could drive someone to drink." Story 73. In grade school, our family's business was 2 blocks away from school. Every day, my sister and I would walk there after class and hang out at the warehouse until my mother finished work to pick us up and bring us home. Being there every day, I met a lot of the people my family did business with, including the United Parcel Service and Federal Express employees. But there was always one person I never managed to meet: Jimmy the mailman. At random times throughout the year, my sister and I would come into the warehouse and find gifts for us. I would get a full set of dinosaur or shark toys. My sister received dolls or similar items. Dad always said, Jimmy the mailman dropped them off. They had bad addresses on the box, so he couldn't deliver them. Or, we always tell him how good you kids are, so he drops these off. I was often told how much Jimmy the mailman would ask about my sister and me, even by the non-family employees at the warehouse. Years later, when I came home on a break from college, it was a rare treat that the whole family was having dinner together. Stories of the old, long gone. Business came up. I eventually asked, whatever happened to Jimmy the mailman? Do you guys keep in touch at all? Everyone started laughing except my grandmother, who said, he's sitting at the table with you now. I looked around the table, laid eyes on Dad, and that's when it clicked. Story 74. My dad was playing at a friend's house when he was 12, and they found an old bullet. He and his friend put it in a vise and tightened it until the bullet shot out and ricocheted around the shed. The bullet hit his friend's forehead, and my dad just ran off and moved across the world the next day. He has no idea what happened to the boy. Story 75. My father-in-law told me a few months ago that his grandfather lost both arms in a farming accident, but he was still able to discipline the children using his sleeves. Story 76. My dad once told me that a minor accident spared him from serving in the Korean War. He received his draft notice, and he and a couple of friends went out drinking the night before their physical examinations. They were involved in a minor accident. When he went to his physical the next day, he failed, likely because of the minor injuries he sustained. He told me they had a saying back then, I don't mind the diarrhea, pyorrhea, or gonorrhea, but please, Lord, don't send me to Korea. Story 77. A picture with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dad was a Navy helicopter pilot and transported him from land to his aircraft carrier. Story 78. My dad told me today that he had onstage passes to a Doobie Brothers concert when he was young and stood behind the drummer the entire concert at the Forum in Los Angeles. What a remarkable experience. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.